A world where private schools have orchestra pits and Olympic swimming pools and public schools have no aircon and dilapidated, overcrowded classrooms is profoundly unfair and unequal. Wealthy or religious parents' right to choose is always outweighed by the vast majority of the most vulnerable and their right to a good education so they can then get a good job and not be stuck in cycles of poverty that is so dehumanising. Two arguments in this speech. Firstly, about why, a practical point about why this makes the education system more equal, and why school choice makes it less equal rather, and secondly, a principal point about choice versus equality. So firstly, on educational inequality. The first thing I'd like to establish in this point is just who is likely to engage in the school choice model. Firstly, we think religious parents are likely in the minority for the simple reason that this debate is set in Western liberal democracies, and religious people, due to growing trends of secularism, or at least seriously religious people who are willing to go to a religious school instead of considering religiosity over quality of schools, are in a very small minority. Like, most people don't have a profound desire in Western liberal democracies to go to a religious school. So secondly, we think the debate primarily takes place in private schools, and that is primarily about rich people who can afford to pay for those things, people who have benefited from centuries or decades of privilege entrenching mechanisms. Thirdly, we think selective schools to a large extent also do benefit the most privileged because in order to access tutoring and things like that, and parents from highly educated backgrounds who have the leisure time to read to you as a child and stuff like that, basically more privileged people are also likely to get into selective schools. So they're the types of people we're talking about in this debate. Secondly, I'd like to know why measures to achieve greater equitability fail in the status quo. That's the things mentioned in the info slides. Firstly, scholarships. There's a number of reasons why this doesn't ameliorate inequality to a significant extent. The first reason for this is that private and religious schools are profit-oriented. The government can't force these schools to give out too many scholarships because they want to make money. Secondly, the government doesn't have the political capital to pay all of the school fees of the people who are getting scholarships, because rich people, have more political power, they make up the people in the government, and they just don't care about things like educational equality and stuff like that. So they don't want to, there won't be political capital to give out a tremendous amount of scholarships. Thirdly, I think just even in the best case, this is only a few people, the most privileged people who are able to get academically selectable sports scholarships of vulnerable minorities who are able to access these things. So the vast majority of underprivileged people are left behind. The second equality mechanism they gave you in the info slide was fee waivers. I suppose government funding does slightly decrease the fees of private schools, but again, these are always profit-extractive businesses who want prestige to attract more people to them. So their fees are always going to be high, and again, there's not really the political capital to reduce them. Thirdly, withdrawing school districts. Again, you might slightly redraw them to get some people at the edge of one district into another, but you're never going to alter them significantly, again, because the rich people in politics don't necessarily want poor people. It is unfortunate but true that they don't want people from underprivileged backgrounds bringing down the prestige of their treasured son's private school. So these corrective measures always help the most privileged, and they never got to the root of the problem, and they never significantly changed things systemically. So what is the impact then of this educational inequality and the school choice model, and why is that bad? Firstly, and most obviously, funding is significantly diverted away from the public schools who needed it so desperately, and instead given to wealthy, privileged private schools who already had enough money, whose people did not need that much help. That's because lobbying and the politics of self-interest means that politicians are going to give a lot to their children's schools. A hard ban is the only way to fix this because it's easier to spot a misallocation of funds, whereas a slight overpaying of your son's private school, for example, was always going to slip under the radar. Secondly, this leads to a decreased faith in the system of public education. That is because obviously when you have less money given to these schools, they're going to perform worse because they have a lower quality of education. But also, it's just a social message that these schools are less good schools because they don't have the extracurricular opportunities and facilities that public schools do. This is terrible for the children in those schools because they feel incredibly hopeless, inferior, swept aside by society, and that leads to them performing worse academically as well because they believe they're not worthy of doing well. But also I think it decreases political capital for reform because people just believe that public schools are a lost cause. Third impact of this is that you just give money to private schools and get more people into private schools, which we will contest is a bad thing. Private schools often lead to a culture of entitlement and worsen the socio-economic divide that is already so pronounced in society. They give people access to a better education, an old students association, extracurricular opportunities, which means networking opportunities, which means it's so much easier for them to get good jobs. Additionally, that separation happens at a softer level as well because you just don't meet people from more diverse backgrounds. All of these things are a harm. Fourthly, like religious schools, again, we would want to generally reduce the number of people who are in them. So thank you. We point to the fact that religious schools are often incredibly traumatic for queer people, and we think it is harm to send unconsenting children into these often hostile environments. So when you decrease government funding, like endorsement of school choice, no thank you, less people are going to be going to these private and religious schools. We think that is a benefit. I will take a point from closing.
Yeah. Wouldn't a larger demand for private schools see a larger supply of secular schooling come into existence, given that most of society now is secular and liberal democracies?
I think it's just that the status quo, right, is the entrenched existing good schools with the prestige are ostensibly religious, so I don't think that would necessarily happen. But in the end, the debate isn't necessarily about religiosity, it's primarily about money and where it goes. And the fact is those are still secular private schools that are going to cost a lot more money and entrenched privilege because you can only afford to go to them if you're wealthy. So what does the world look like now? It means education is split along economic lines and there's a profoundly unequal access to opportunity. When you oppose the school choice model, you have equal access to education, less social stratification and inequality, and a chance for social mobility and being able to escape generational cycles of poverty, which can benefit literally millions of people who are currently stuck in underfunded and underprivileged public schools. My second argument in this speech that is a preemptive principle about why we would weigh equality over choice. The government has an obligation to provide education to everyone, and your right to higher quality education, slightly higher quality through a private school, once you've met a base standard of education, does not outweigh the vast majority of underprivileged people's right to receive a basic standard of education that is so much more impactful to them because it gets them out of cycles of poverty a lot of the time. And additionally, I think schools get better for everyone at the point that public school funding is diverted to private school funding is diverted to public schools. In terms of religious freedom, as I noted, these are a minority in this debate because it's a place set in secular places. But in terms of people who are intensely religious, there are other ways to express your faith, such as going to places of worship, education in the home. We would even, in some instances, support homeschooling. And in terms of selective schools, I think, while it's good to provide for gifted children, the government fundamentally has an obligation to the most vulnerable because the education they provide them will be so much more impactful, and that is why we've been this debate.
And if you think that the open government has the fear to change the entire public school system to an extent that they will be at par with the private school system, that is going to close the wage gap, that's going to close class divide, because now public school systems are able to give students the best facilities and are at par at private school, the same networking, the same amount of facilities, then I think you should immediately award the debate to OG. But I guess they do not have the fear to do that, because the private school system and the public school system are very distinct, and they can never be at par irrespective of how much material you put into it. Three things in the speech: firstly, characterizations; secondly, how we help low to middle SES people; and lastly, why this helps religious minorities. First bit of characterization. First question to ask here is, what does the school choice movement actually look like? This obviously looks like, again, one, funding for private schools; secondly, scholarships for private schools and selective schools; thirdly, religious schools will exist as a principle; and then obviously we have stuff like fee waivers, maybe we have fee vouchers, and all of that exists. The second question to ask after characterization is, what does the school system actually look like? Again, we agree with OG's characterization in that the public school system actually kind of sucks and the private school system is very good. However, that's the issue. The gap between the public school system and the private school system cannot be bridged, because the private school system will always one-up you, and this is what I'm going to explain in my speech. Now, how do we actually help low SES and middle SES people? What this point is going to establish is that it was trying to prove is that if we elevate a certain section of people upward and we provide them with upward mobility and all of the benefits that OG talk about that are accessible at private schools, that is why then we show you that we are giving these people some level of upward mobility, and that these impacts would be debate winning. Now, first piece of context here is that, again, obviously the public school system is not as good as compared to the private school system. No amount of funding can actually substantially raise them to the level of private schools, because private schools will always have a way to one-up them. They always have, the private school students will always have access to better jobs, they would have access to the best teachers, they would have access to the best infrastructure, and they would have better networking and social outcomes, they would have like a better extracurricular opportunity. And the public school system will always just be there. And the important thing to note here is that you never have the amount of fiat that you need, and the amount of capital, political capital and financial capital that you need to raise them is just simply impossible. And so the best way we can elevate people who belong to the middle and maybe upper lower SES section of society is give them access to these private schools. This is what the school choice movement, this is why the school choice movement is important. Note that we obviously understand that private school system does like kind of uplift the rich, and it's like uplifting the already fucking uplifted. But the thing is, in any world they would obviously have access to these private schools, and so the delta of this debate is actually, the delta of this debate lies in the middle income and the low SES people, because they can never access private schools or the best schools or selective schools unless they have been given scholarships, unless they have fee waivers, unless they get school vouchers from governments, unless they get subsidies from governments, which is why it is important to have the school choice movement, because this is where the actual delta of this debate lies. The opening government tries to talk about how these people never actually get the benefits, that they never get scholarships, but that's completely untrue. Because they are like kids from these communities are smart, given that they often do not have the best help or the best tutors, but that doesn't mean there aren't smart kids. And in fact, like look at immigrant parents and their kids, they're highly competitive, highly smart. Any characterization of them as not smart is just not true, because there are a few students within that category who would be able to access the best scholarships. Secondly, there is obviously a social and image factor that are aligned to these private schools, given that they don't want to seem as the worst, like most exclusive schools, in the sense that they're like looking down on other people, given that there are several image and publicity factors that are aligned to it. Look at the media and how it reports about private schools and how gross their funding is. There is obviously a social pressure to do that. And thirdly, there are also economically weaker section quotas, given that a lot of public funding that people get from different schools are often contingent on the amount of people from a specific class of society that they accept in, and the specific race and other AA requirements that schools have to fulfill in order to get the amount of public funding that they do get. Which means, and so what are the impacts of this point? The impacts of this point are quite clear. We get a few people from the lower and middle SES people who can now access the private school and the best education into these schools, which means that we get them better education, we get them better networking, which is so important for social mobility. The amount of the political and social capital that OG says that they never get, we give them access to it, because when kids from these communities have access to jobs and they are able to eventually uplift their community. Look at the Indian diaspora. The fact that there are CEOs that are Indian, like Satya Nadella and all of these, is a huge boost in social capital for Indians. And that is the thing. It does uplift entire communities when they see people from their community being successful, only because they had access to networks that were networks in the first place. They had access to the better jobs, they had access to the best education. This is the only way you can actually get any benefit for these people, because the public school system will never actually improve anything. The public school system will raise the next generation of factory workers, or like workers who are going to work below people who would eventually get access to the best jobs, because the private school has access, like their parents are like fucking CEOs and everything. Yes.
Would you rather give a scholarship to one low SES person, or improve schools in low SES areas by diverting literally hundreds of millions?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to cut you off, sorry. But the thing is, this question is so misleading, because it is not one lower SES person and then 1,000 SES people, the low upper SES people. That's not the comparative, and that's completely uncharitable to us, because the delta is more than one people. And as I explained, it is a huge downstream of benefits for people within those communities, because when you go to school with members of parliament and their children are going to grow up to be members of parliament, that is how you improve social mobility and get the political and social capital that you need to uplift your entire community. That is how you access any benefits on that side. And again, the comparative is private schools will still exist, private schools will still have the best education, and people would still be left out of it. This is the best way to actually start bridging that gap. Slowly, but surely it does do that. Last point is the standing on how this helps religious minorities. We believe that religious minorities in liberal democracies come from a huge influx of immigrants, given that they have a high, which means there is a high population of different cultures, because people often move to liberal democracies to get a better life, better opportunities, which means that they're separated from the culture and the religion, and they're often protective about it, which is why they often form insular communities. And we think that in that case, it is important for them to have the opportunity, as a point of principle, to send their children to a school of their choice, a school that reflects the religion, and because there are often structural reasons that keep them away from actually intermingling with society, and it's best that they have the opportunity to protect the culture that they want, because the comparative is that religious schools still exist, everything bad that they talk about will still exist, all harms still exist. This is the only way to bridge any gaps and build parents' choice. So proud to oppose.
Our contention in this debate is not that we were going to delete and remove private schools. It's simply that a world in which families don't believe in the public education system, indeed where they believe that school choice is necessary, that represents a kind of social idea that public education is not what their child needs, not what their child wants. And the outcome of that is that governments spend time and money redrawing school districts, making and lobbying private schools to provide scholarships, and doing a number of other measures like giving literal tax breaks to these institutions, which is money and time and energy that should be spent benefiting the public schools that are already struggling, benefiting the majority of students who now are able to access a higher level of education. Because look at the language of the opening opposition speaker when they say things like, sure, it may be a minority of students, but that is still a benefit. No, the government has an obligation to better the education for the majority of people. That is their elected responsibility. We are the only team that proves the majority of students are benefited. 3 parts to this speech. Firstly, why school choice worsens the educational outcomes and equitability of education. Secondly, I'll touch on vulnerable religious communities. And then thirdly, I'm just going to push choice out of the debate in case that is something that closing wants to run. Let's start though with why this worsens the educational outcomes and equitability of education. And the framing that I just want to reiterate here is to think about what school choice as a movement indicates about the nature of education right now. Because if public education was something that was invested in, was something that people believed in, school choice wouldn't exist as a movement because people would just believe that sending their kids to the local school was necessary. So what are the harms of this then? What are the harms of the school choice movement existing and being supported? First, if you just delete attempts to actually better the public education system. Why? First, because fiscal spending decreases. That is, you're no longer lobbying your government to do things like improve the public education system. You're lobbying your government to give tax breaks to big, expensive private schools that your child can get in there. Secondly though, you just decrease the faith of individuals for education. That is society as a whole. But I think incredibly importantly, it's for the students within that system, because I think opening opposition, and indeed this opposition bench, must concede that only a small minority of people will be able to flourish in school choice. And so every other student who now exists in public education probably feels left behind, probably feels like they have no real choice, probably feels like their system is going to fail and they're never going to succeed. How does this interact with the case given by opening opposition? Because their main claim is that private schools will A, always be better, and B, always be there, and therefore this is the best way to elevate vulnerable students. A number of responses to this argument. The first thing I'm going to do is simply prove why the school choice movement will fail. And if you believe that the school choice movement will fail, you can't give them any benefit, because no low socioeconomic people are even going to access these educations. They don't have the fiat to kind of make sure that the school choice movement is successful. Why will it ultimately fail? Number of reasons. First, no thank you. Just think about who holds political sway and who holds corporate capture and things like that. It is not the low socioeconomic people who want to better their educational chances. And the intuitive reason for that is that if they held political capital, obviously public education would be better. The people who control government, the people who control the kind of spheres of influence around education are rich people. And these people have every incentive to make sure that this doesn't happen. Why? Because they probably are kind of alienate low socioeconomic people, and they perceive this policy to be something which forces low socioeconomic people into the classrooms of their own children. But secondly, I just think it directly harms them, right? Why is it spending their money and their kind of their tax dollars to do things like provide scholarships providing any benefit for them, I think most of them are probably able to just perceive that it's not useful, and therefore they're likely to like kill this as a policy. But secondly, think about the kinds of institutions they are trying to change. It's things like private schools giving more scholarships. Private schools don't want to give scholarships because they lose money. Like, that's so intuitive, right? If you have more scholarship students, you're having less students paying you dollars. That is not something you want. And the reason this is important is, firstly, it just means that A, they don't receive any real benefit, but B, if they do, it's just an incredibly small one that's outweighed by the harm that exists for every other institution. Because think about it just as a matter of mathematics. If they spend $10 million, $100 million kind of redrawing these boundaries, lobbying these institutions for maybe a handful of students to now access private education, compare that to the benefit of spending $10 million, or literally just even $1 million to increase the number of teachers that exist in rural schools. Like, the kind of scale and the kind of delta for us in this debate is just so massive that it outweighs any small marginal benefit that they're able to achieve. Let's deal with like their best case though, which is a world in which a few clever students access this education. The first response is, again, just to mitigate it. Their own language indicates this is a few students. But secondly, I think losing these students to private schools is probably a harm, because it means that the public schools are just worse performing, which kind of perpetuates the problem, right? Like, all of the good students just leave, access private school, and kind of do well there, which means that no one in the public education system is able to kind of get good results and prove that public education is something worth investing in. Sure.
Yeah, if the rich like control politics, if the people in the private schools that control politics, why would they want to improve public schools? And isn't your admission that the public school system is failing an admission that like this is the case? Like, they aren't improving public schools?
No, right? Because the problem is that the majority of people don't access private school. The majority of people are in public schools, so there is a level of like political immobility in order to lobby for certain things. But the problem is that the change is that if you believe that there is a certain number of capital you're able to achieve by lobbying a government, we should divert that capital into public schools and not other institutions, right? Like, obviously the change that we're dealing with on either side is small. We're just saying we should direct that small change to public schools. So let's weigh our world against that opening opposition. Because again, it's a marginal benefit for a small minority of students. For us, we just improve public schools. If they waste capital on lobbying for scholarships, they cannot do things like increase the number of teachers that exist in under-resourced communities. Let's deal with their next push, which is about vulnerable religious communities. A number of responses. First, their own framing suggests that these religious communities are indeed like communities, which I think suggests that they're perhaps not as vulnerable as they say they are. Like, if you're living in a certain diaspora, presumably you're not as kind of vulnerable to the outside world. But secondly, we in our first speech literally say that if you're incredibly religious, you can just homeschool your child. That is something we literally give you in the first few minutes of our first speech. But thirdly, again, just mitigate this. This is an incredibly small number of people. The government obviously has an opportunity cost. It should just prioritize the most vulnerable, and the majority of people. That is not these communities. Finally, choice. Why do you not necessarily have the choice to decide the education institution of your child? And the first thing I want to observe here is just the moral premise that's already accepted in the status quo, which is that you can't pull your child out of education, right? Like, the government forces you to put your child in some system of education, which should immediately prove to you that the government has a kind of control that outweighs the rights of the parent. Like, at the point at which they can't remove you altogether, that kind of indicates that we already accept the government should control it. But secondly, it's just that the obligations of government outweigh the rights of parents, because they are responsible for a larger number of people so incredibly proud to propose.
Yep.
I think OG loses this debate when they fail to actually mechanistically explain to you how you actually get reform of the public school system in a way that is like widespread, that is effective, that actually helps people. I think they suffer from a fatal like fiat mismatch in which they assume that the small amount of capital that goes, or the relatively small amount of capital that goes into the various aspects of school choice or the school choice movement is equal to the amount of capital that you would need to bring public schools up to a level where they're equal to private schools, to a level where they're able to perform to the same level of success as private schools. I think it is just like so much of their case is uncredible because they rely on this like insane amount of fiat that just doesn't exist in this debate and could never exist in like a realistic world. I think that you necessarily have to give the debate to OO because we are the only team in the opening clash so far that actually explains how you get actual benefits for the people that they claim to care so much about, for the people in the public school system, for people of minority backgrounds, for children of immigrants. I think that's incredibly important. And insofar as they don't actually do any mechanistic work to explain to you what reform looks like and how they get it, I think that you just absolutely cannot give them the debate. So, what am I going to do in this speech? Firstly, a bit of whipping of unjust speech, because they just fucking ignore it, and the bits that they don't ignore, they straw man, which is deeply uncharitable. And it was a really good speech, so let's hear a bit of it again. Next, I'm going to talk about what's come out on opening government. So, okay, already tells you all this stuff about like religious minorities, about immigrants. They kind of ignore it, but then their response is just like, oh, well, you could just like homeschool your kids instead. And also like they're in communities, so their lives are fine. But really, what? Like, I think it's just like so deeply intuitive that just because you live in a small community in a nation that is not your home nation, that doesn't necessarily mean that you get to avoid things like racism, like systemic biases against you, like poverty. Like just because I live next door to my friend who like is also Jewish doesn't mean that we get to avoid anti-Semitism. That is just like the weirdest push I've ever heard. Don't believe it. But the other thing to say is just that like those people deserve to go into schools where they are actually like catered to, where they are with members of their community. You can't just like shunt them off and be like, well, we don't want a religious school for you, so we're just gonna homeschool you. I don't think this makes any sense. But the other thing to say is just that like I really don't think that you can believe that they get such dramatic reform for public schools that you necessarily have to award in this debate. I think that actually CO points out in a POI that just like capital and influence still lies with rich people. It's just like not, they still have all the influence, all the capital to be able to influence Parliament. They just like don't care about bettering the public school system. This is not something that they're invested in, which means that necessarily to get any better outcomes for people from low SES backgrounds, you necessarily have to open the gates to the private school system, to selective schools. Yeah, okay. I think UND impacts this for you pretty clearly. You get things like actual capital, you get things like political capital, you get things like social capital. This is incredibly influential for you and your community. This is really, really important and largely unresponded to, and I think that you need to give it a lot of credit in this debate. Okay, at the end of that, I think it's incredibly important, and they try to just wave it away, maybe because they just don't have a good response to it. They try to wave away this idea that like people from religious communities necessarily are like, and who will often intersect with a minority like immigrant communities. Yeah, they just like don't respond to this push at all. I think it's really important, and I think prefer to unjust speech for all the reasons why. Okay, I'll take a point from closing.
No, thank you.
I'll take a point from opening.
Our contention is not that you have no capital for school choice, but that it is small. Isn't it better to invest that in a teacher for 20 students rather than 10 students accessing a private school?
But that's just like such a mischaracterization of your entire case so far. Like, I think that the capital and the impact of getting a couple of students into a private school where they receive really good quality education and can then channel the impacts of that education back into their community is just so much more impactful than like the drop in the bucket of what is needed to fix public schools. Note that like OO's contention is not that like, oh, we don't care about public schools, we think public schools suck, let's give money to rich people. It's just that like to create the biggest impact, you necessarily have to consider where you allocate your resources and what the biggest impact from that is. Okay, so let's talk about the opening government case. So I think the problem, as I flagged in my intro, the problem with opening government case is that you just like never explain how you get a meaningful influx of capital into public schools. As Unj explains to you in their intro, they simply just don't have the fiat to do this. Be very careful about the way that you adjudicate the fiat in this debate, because I think there is a limited amount, and I think that OO spends it best. But even if you don't believe that, I think they have a pretty significant mechanistic issue in that they never explain to you like how these resources actually meaningfully help to the same degree that we explained to you at UNJ, which is just that like a few students are able to succeed massively in life because of the benefits they get from going to a private or selective school. Then they give you this push about like how parent choice will never outweigh equality. She doesn't spend that much time on this, but I think insofar as like you believe everything that I've already told you about how like they just don't provide a mechanism for this equality, you necessarily have to care at least a little bit about choice, or at least not care that much about what they tell you about equality. I think the principle is nice, but I think it's incredibly important to just be realistic in this debate. Okay, then when we hear at DPM, I think think the other main push that they give you is that people have a loss of faith in public schools. I think this is, and also the youth capacity for reform of the public education system. I think this is so deeply untrue, and I just don't understand how it could possibly be true. I think as everybody in this debate has already agreed, the large majority of people are still going to be in public schools. There is a significant incentive to push for reform for public schools. I don't think the capital, the school choice movement, necessarily comes at the cost of the capital or reform movement for public schools, insofar as so many people still go to public schools, insofar as you're in a liberal democracy where you can vote in terms of policy that will improve public schools. I don't understand why this is true. I think there is significant potential to still reform public schools. I don't think you get to delete reform efforts from this debate. The other thing to say, the other thing that they tell you is oh, well, UP has no fiat to say that the school choice movement succeeds. What? It's already a movement, it already exists. That's the first thing to say, is that it's empirical. Other things, things like scholarships exist in our world, exist in every world. They give you a bunch of stuff about corporate capital, blah, 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 we're not gonna have scholarships anymore. I don't think that you can buy this just because they use words like corporate and stuff. Scholarships exist under every side of the house. Schools have incentives to provide scholarships in terms of image, in terms of the tax breaks that they tell you that they get in the info slide. I don't understand why this is a thing. Also see all of Anja's speech about why private schools still have an incentive to provide scholarships. I also think just from a reputational standpoint, it's really sick if you can put some brown kids on your private school flyer. That's probably really good for your image. You probably want to do that. So after all of that, I think that you necessarily have to discount a lot of the opening government case because they don't have the fiat, they provide you no mechanisms, and the greatest impact in this case comes from a small amount of capital to the people who actually need it the most. Proud to negate, whatever.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. Now to open up the closing half of this debate, as well as closing government, I welcome up the government member. Here.
Yes.
The thing that has been missed so far within tonight's debate is that the school choice isn't just to be able to choose to go to different private schools. It isn't just to be able to get your child out of the public schools and into the private school system. It's also to be able to choose which public schools you want to be able to attend. It's the dissolving of the school district so that you're able to, even if you can't get into those private schools, move to a different public school that is so much better. Two key things that I'll demonstrate within this speech for our extension. Firstly, around how school choice isn't only private schools and how we're actually able to get better outcomes and better public schools under our side of the house, completely taking all the benefits from OG. And secondly, around how we also get better benefits and just better private schools in general, overall improving education for everyone. Moving on to, first about school choice not being only private schools. We've heard a whole heap of stuff from Opening Bench about, firstly, how we end up with all of this, all of this high socioeconomic class just creating all of this corruption within these private school systems. We end up with them forcing these private school systems to get all of the funding so that all of these private schools end up with all the funding. They end up with all the high socioeconomic children in these schools, and we end up with all these terrible outcomes. Firstly, demonstrating why we're going to get this under the public school system anyway. And that's because parents in higher socioeconomic classes have the ability to simply move house. They have the financial ability to be able to move into different school districts. If you're forcing everyone from a particular school district to go to a particular public school, then they're simply going to end up, all we're going to see are communities of rich, higher socioeconomic people going to rich public schools that are going to get all of the funding, because we've already heard all of the mechanisms from GovBench about how corrupt these systems are, about how these public schools, whether they're going to be public or private, are going to be able to get manipulated to get this kind of funding are going to be able to, even just simply because there's schools in areas with higher land value, they're going to end up with more funding, and they're going to end up with these public schools just simply having a collection of all of these higher socioeconomic students. Anyway, what do we get instead that is able to actually outweigh this? We allow students to be able to go to public schools outside of their districts. This means if you've got students living in a low socioeconomic area, they're still able to get into those public schools in the higher socioeconomic areas. They're able to directly get benefits from those public schools without having to move into those different areas, without having to pay the ridiculous prices of moving that are simply just not available to the lower socioeconomic classes. We're also able to actually see more competition between the public schools. One of the reasons that public schools are so terrible is that they've got a guaranteed number of students every year. They have to get all of the students that are within their area. They have to get the students within their district. So they've got no reason, no motivation to actually do any better, to actually try to provide better extracurricular activities or anything else, because they're forcing the students to go there anyway. Instead, what we're able to see, if we're able to get this sort of school choice, if we're able to get students being able to choose which public school they go to, or being able to choose much more accessibly to go to a private school, we're able to see these public schools having incentives to try to actually offer activities so they're able to try and get more students to go there. I'll take one from Open.
Doesn't moving from a less privileged to more privileged public school just incur the same harms of moving from a public to private school that we bring you, because better performing public schools don't have the capacity to take everyone, and this diverts funding away from the more lower SES underprivileged schools?
Can you rephrase that?
Doesn't moving from less privileged to more privileged public schools incur exactly the same harms of moving from a public school to a private school that we bring you, because it diverts funding away from these underprivileged SES, low SES schools that people are
No,
moving
because we
away
think
from?
it's so much more accessible for these students in these low SES areas to be able to move into these schools. You don't bring us any sort of mechanism. All you get on your side of the house is that these students living in these low socioeconomic areas, which aren't going to get any more funding to their schools anyway, there aren't going to be any more funding to these areas because no one in the political sphere is going to really care about them. They're not going to get any more of this funding, and they're simply going to be trapped at those schools without any mechanism, without any way to be able to get out, to be able to move to any sort of better school. We're able to instead see a way and a mechanism for those students to get out of those sort of schools, to be able to move into schools with better areas, to be able to diversify these schools more, and get more students into better schools, both the better private schools that are already demonstrated and these better public schools. We also think that this is also completely counter to what we've heard from, I believe it was CG about OG about parental choice is just not available because all students are forced to go to school. We just think that that's completely ridiculous here. And that it means that instead of the current system being exclusive to rich parents and high socioeconomic parents being able to have any sort of school choice that we're going to stand with the government bench, because they're still able to pay to be able to move house, we're able to open this to low socioeconomic students. This is going to have a massive impact because we're able to improve these public schools and to improve education for absolutely everybody. No, thank you. Moving on to how are we going to actually get better private schools as well and better education just in general. We think that firstly, if you have more students that have greater accessibility to be able to go to private schools, it means that you have more competition within these private schools, and it also means you have more demand for private schools. This has two key benefits here. Firstly, the greater competition is going to result in these private schools actually needing to compete with each other, trying to provide the best education, trying to provide the best services, and also trying to provide the best prices. Because now you've got students that aren't just the most wealthy students ever to exist, that are able to have the opportunity to get these schools, that have all of this money to be able to give to these schools. There's going to be a massive demand for private schools. They're in the price range for these students to be able to attend. You're going to see private schools that are catering not just to the most wealthy upper class, but are actually able to cater to more middle class and lower class because there's so much of a demand there. We also think that from this, we're going to see a complete change in the amount of religious private schools that we currently see. We instead think that we're going to be able to see much more secular private schools because there's so much of a demand for them, because there's so much more opportunity for secular students to actually go into these private schools, because there's so much of a demand for secular private schools. We end up with so many more of them, which means we end up with more secular private schools, making it so much easier for queer students, for minorities, for all of those sorts of groups to be able to get into these private schools, to be able to get high quality education. We're able to change the complete composition of our class. We're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition.
Ready? Alright, panel. Just to finish off tonight's debate, I'd first like to thank all the other teams for making this the easiest opposition whip speech I will ever deliver. The first and best. Alright, now moving on. I'm just going to go through very briefly what we get from government bench, why we come out on top on opening, why we come out on top on closing. I'm going to briefly explain why we get none of the all work under closing government's extension, and only thanks to closing government's extension we prove all the benefits that came out at closing of, and why we prove all the benefits that came out at opening of, and then I'm going to prove why all of the government bench benefits and harms the harms continue to exist into perpetuity, they're never mitigated, and then the benefits don't ever come into fruition. Just briefly though, some really quick rebuttal. We got from closing government just now that it's an active harm in response to a POI. It's an active harm to get ethnic and queer minorities into privileged areas, because they'll be bullied or something. Ultimately, if you really want to get queer minority representation, if you want to get ethnic minority representation into these socioeconomic stratas, there's unfortunately a hurdle that you have to pass. And it is a detriment to society that hurdle has to be some level of social assimilation or some bullying. Hang on. It is unfortunate that is the case, but ultimately once we reach that hurdle, society will be better off for it, right? We heard briefly from Tiarna on why minority representation in these schools will be better, why that will go on to lead to higher representation, higher socioeconomic stratas, and not only that, right? We heard from every other team tonight why political capital is super important, all the rich people have it, all these rich people are in private schools, all the networking happens in private schools. So obviously, the logical conclusion from every other team is that we want to just get these minorities into all these rich private schools to get them to network and to get that all those benefits on social and political capital. If there is an open POI, I'll briefly take it.
There are a majority of people access public schools, so there is some political capital. But wealthy people have more lobbying power. Surely using this limited capital to get more textbooks to more students is far more important than gifting scholarships to a small amount of students.
So we actually proved at Tiarna exactly why more public schools will have an incentive to do better, which is to say they'll have an incentive to get more students, which means delivering a better education, which means doing better marketing, which means having better resources, having better infrastructure, buying more textbooks, which means at the end of the day, we gave you all the benefits why public schools benefit the most under this opposition bench, right? And which is to say that government bench completely neglects any of the benefits, any reforms, right? They give us we need reforms, reforms are important, public schools suck. We never get any mechanisms as to that. Even in closing we were told we would get it, we never got it, right? But we gave you the mechanisms exactly why under opposition bench you get those reforms, why they're better, what they look like, and how they come into fruition. We heard from closing, just briefly, on that the competition metrics only exist in the higher socioeconomic areas, that ultimately it's more about academic prestige, and there's no other factors that contribute to competition metrics. We think this went totally unproven, it was just a throwaway claim that they spent 1 minute on at the very end. But to be totally clear, no thank you, to be totally clear, we think that competition metrics not only do exist for low and middle socioeconomic areas, that once you eliminate school districts, that is the barrier to competition metrics dominating the public education sector, no thank you. Which is to say, once I have the freedom to send my kid to the school district that is 2 catchments over, that's the point at which the competition metrics matter. Because right now, I'm locked in. If I can't afford the private school, I'm locked in, or if I'm not religious, I'm locked into sending my kid to this public school that, as government bench told us, is just detrimented. It's failing. It's already incurred all of these harms due to the political capital being focused elsewhere, right? They claim it was on school choice. We actually think that the school choice movement is obviously the best thing in tonight's debate, that this isn't distracting people. Go ahead.
You can't just take everyone from one public school and push them to a different public school. They have capacity. How then do you get this competition?
They have capacity, and they'll be incentivized to increase their capacity, right? To get the better teachers on their books, to instruct the best education systems, right? Which is to say, they might open more campuses. They might buy all the houses next door, which is to say they'll have more room to teach more students to deliver a better education, right? Which is also to say that if you the best public school in the state or in your city is already full, then you'll have to send your kids somewhere else, which is to say that that education system will improve because like the next best one will be chosen, which just further improves metrics, right? Which is to say, like, if I can't get an Uber, I'm going to go to Didi, and then now Didi is like a better platform, a better service provider because they get more customers. No, thank you. I've already taken two. I'm pretty much done, but you can keep asking if you like. Alright, so where do we fit in on tonight's debate? So we hear from OG two main pushes. One on practical, like equality in education is like important, like we want all the funding to go into public schools because at the point at which you get people into private schools, like it's kind of funny actually, they pretty much preempted and then accepted OO's claim that like you get more people into private schools, and then they said that this was bad because private school funding will increase and public schools will be like left in the ditch. Then they also contradicted themselves later and said, oh no, you won't get more people into private schools. It's kind of unclear how that all fits in. But let's suppose you do get more people into private schools and private schools get more funding. This was already conceded by everyone on government bench as a good thing because better education exists in the private school sector. Not only that, we brought you out on PI, we brought you out on analysis that myself and Tiarna, that when you get low to middle socioeconomic stratas into these private schools, into these wealthier areas, what you end up with is a high representation of queer and ethnic minorities, which is something that all teams acknowledge is like something to like desire, but we never really heard any content on like why government bench achieves this better, because they don't, right? Then we heard on like why equality is better than choice. They made this claim that was just like totally unproven, that like because the government forces everyone to go to school, therefore like they should have like absolute rights, and like parents, like the parents' right is just like totally trumped in this way. We actually don't agree with that. We think that there's a unique reason that the parental right is like more important here, and it's not a question of like libertarianism or like, oh, we want to stay away from the state. It's actually a question of what's better for society. The government cannot possibly have the interests of every student in mind, right? That is just not feasible. It's like, it involves like a level of like compromises and like placing numbers on people that is just unacceptable. But when we empower parents to make the correct decisions, right? And Tiarna brought you this just briefly on like why we don't accept this claim. I'm just expanding on it. This is not unique material, right? When we empower parents to provide the best education for their children, those interests are like more tailored, they're more fruitful for that student. It might look like they go to like a more academic school, it might look like they go to a more athletic school. Ultimately, we would prefer that parents will inform and empowered to make those decisions rather than just the state in every single case. We get from CG, yeah, like I said, like it's an active harm to get people into these minority areas. We get that like the political capital that's spent on the school choice movement is like a failure and a waste, but like I pretty much sufficiently took that down in rebuttal. I don't think any of it really stands, and the like again, the extension that we got from them was pretty like low impact. It wasn't really weighed especially well. But on the question of OO and why we take out opposition bench, so again, opening half completely focused, as Tiarna told you, on like why private schools are like the preeminent like thing to be focused on. They pretty much totally neglected the public school sector, which we proved to you at Tiarna will encompass the vast majority of students. Even if you can't prove OO's benefit, that like they get more people into private schools, we still drive all the benefits of improving public schools through those competition metrics. On the question of like, on the question of like, funneling improvement in resources and technology and infrastructure, we won on that. We ultimately improved all education sectors. That's why CO takes the win.